Started. We've been looking through different facets of things that we all long for in our society today. Regardless of what our faith commitments are, regardless of what our background is, we all long for things like a meaningful community, for stable identity, for meaning and purpose that lasts throughout our life. And today we come to the issue of justice without exploitation, our desire for a suitable foundation for morality. I'll read just a couple of quotes to you. This is from Michael Sandel. He's a professor at Harvard who teaches ethics there. And he explains, quote, "Science can investigate nature and inquire into the empirical world, but it cannot answer moral questions or disprove free will. That is because morality and freedom are not empirical concepts." What is empirical? What's an empirical concept? It's empirical is something that you can verify scientifically, something that you can measure or hold or examine. And he's saying that free will and morality and freedom, these are not empirical concepts. We can't prove that they exist, but neither can we make sense of our moral lives without presupposing them. That last sentence is really shocking. You cannot prove that human rights, that human freedom exist, in the sense that you can put it into a lab or a beaker, or you can do an experiment on it that boils it down to find those things. Yet, they are so central to our experience of life that we don't know how to make sense of this life unless they exist. All right, so that's coming from one angle. Let me come in from another angle that's a little bit more intuitive to what makes sense to us as inheritors of this kind of world we live in right now. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You may know that because that was a saying that Barack Obama often said, and he said that because Martin Luther King said that often, and Martin Luther King said that because Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist in the 19th century, was the one who coined that phrase. And it's this beautiful picture of the idea that human life is full of suffering and difficulty. The arc of the moral universe is long. It's not simple, yet it bends towards a goal. There's a point, and that is justice. So it's an acknowledgement of injustice in human experience, yet a goal, a teleology, a purpose. We will arrive at a more just society. The problems that we see in this world will be fixed. Now, I think that if we were to ask most skeptics of Christianity today, the most common reason for why they would be skeptical towards Christianity, I don't think would be primarily scientific arguments. I don't think would be primarily historical or philosophical arguments. I think their primary reason to be skeptical of Christianity and the church would be a moral one. That in the long arc of the moral universe, they would say that Christians seem to be ones who are bending it away from justice, not towards it. And we want to be part of the people who are helping that arc bend towards justice. And so Christianity seems implausible. So maybe you've heard something like this before. I've been hurt by the church. My family's been hurt by the church. Christians advocate and stand for things that are backwards, that are morally reprehensible. Haven't evil things been done in the past by Christians in the name of God? Let's take that last point and just look at one example from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Frederick Douglass was a slave who escaped and became an abolitionist and wrote one of the most beautiful stories and compelling stories of what it was like to both be a slave and what freedom was like. And if you've never read his book, Narrative of a Life, you should read it. It is a wonderful, wonderful story. But he tells the story about one of the slave owners that he had was not a Christian, was an irreligious man. And then he converted to Christianity. And Frederick at first was hopeful that this would mean that the man would then become more gentle and more compassionate, but the exact opposite happened. He became more brutal, more exacting, and more cruel. And here's what he writes. "Were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. For all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I have found them almost invariably the vilest, meanest, and basest of their class. So when someone says, haven't Christians done bad things in the past? Yeah. Things that were anyone in this church to participate in any of that, we would all be morally outraged. All right, and that's just one example. We could come up with lots of others, right? You could just think of all of the stories recently that we've heard about sexual abuse happening inside of the church. Or in the past, we could think of the wars in the 16th century in Europe between Protestants and Catholics. You could think of the Spanish Inquisition. And you can think of all sorts of stories of the church and Christians having participated in things that we now consider to be immoral. So, many modern people today have a default posture. We're at one point, the default posture towards the church and towards Christianity was one of an assumption of trust, an assumption of goodwill, that here in this belief and in this institution, there was a force for good. Now the opposite is almost true. Now there is an assumption of skepticism and wariness. If past generations found the basis for morality to come from religion, but now our generation is skeptical of that source, what does that mean? Well, it does not mean that this generation and skeptical people are immoral people, or they don't care about morality. In fact, I think you could make the argument that the generation alive today, I'd say millennials and Gen Z, let's just look at that. You could make the case that they are significantly more moral than previous generations. And by that, I just mean they are intensely serious about issues of justice, righteousness, morality, and immorality. So if we are people who are deeply interested in morality, yet we are skeptical of the traditional framework from where morality came from, then where do we look? What do we have? So let's look at what a typical skeptical person would look at for a new foundation for where their moral compass comes from. Okay, so let's look at a new basis for morality. Let me present to you a classic proof of the existence of God. This is what's typically known as the moral argument for God. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. And that's a formally valid syllogism, meaning that if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. And it's a pretty powerful argument. So if anyone is wanting to escape from the conclusion of that argument, they need to first demonstrate that either of those two premises are false. So let's enter the viewpoint of a skeptic and try to invalidate what those are saying. So let's look first at that first premise. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Well, someone could just say, well, of course that's wrong. Objective moral values and duties can exist without God. And they could rely on a whole host of different ways that they would look at their different sources of framework. So they could say, just first off, well, I can rely on my rationality to discern moral values. There are certain moral facts that are self-evident, right? You think of the Declaration of the Independence that describes that there are certain things that are self-evident, like the right to life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness. So they would argue, all we need is the right mental framework to discern what those self-evident moral truths are. There are just certain things that are just obvious, like 2 + 2 makes 4, and it's wrong to use your strength and power to needlessly hurt someone who is weaker than yourself. That's just self-evident. Or, so that's one avenue, is you could just look at the self-evident truths that could rationally be discerned. Another avenue could be the avenue of science or biology, something that could empirically prove right or wrong. So social studies and behavioral scientists can look at what certain factors and attitudes and behaviors lead to human happiness and which lead to human suffering. Evolution is often used in this vein as an explanatory hypothesis for where our moral impulses come from. So the herd instinct is one common manifestation of that reasoning. So the reason why we feel a great desire to care for our families and to practice courage and to tell the truth is because those had survival value for ancestors. And so now they can promote human flourishing and the production of human happiness and the downplay of human suffering. So it's an empirical perspective. It can be scientifically proven. Or third, you could just look at someone's life who's not a believer, someone who's an atheist, and you could see that they can live moral lives. And conversely, you can look at someone who's a very religious person, and they can live very immoral lives. Doesn't that simply prove that you don't have to have a religious foundation to be moral? So we have three possible avenues here. A rational outlet, self-evident truths that you can discern with your mind. An empirical outlet, there are certain behaviors and characteristics that simply lead to empirically tested, provable human flourishing. Or you could just say, no, duh, it's obvious. You don't need a religious foundation to be a moral person. Look at all these good people I know who don't go to church. Okay, what would a Christian say in response to that? Let's take a crack at it in reverse order. So let's start with the no duh approach. Christianity does not teach that one must believe in God in order to live morally. In fact, the Bible explains that because all human beings are made in the image of God, that means that every human being has a certain amount of moral energy inherent to us. We all are very moral creatures and moralizing creatures. That's why no matter what happens to faith in our country, we will be a remarkably moral people because we are all made in the image of God. And so we all have an intuitive impulse to say right and wrong. And just like it's possible for you to rev an engine but go nowhere if the clutch isn't engaged, so too can an individual have a mental framework that they fail to live consistently by. So a religious person can have a moral framework that should lead them to a moral life, but if they don't engage the clutch of that worldview, they can live an immoral life. Likewise, an irreligious person can have a worldview that doesn't provide a great basis or foundation for morality. Yet, if they don't engage that worldview into their actual life, then their life can look very different than what a consistent application of their worldview would look like. So we're not claiming that if you are a religious person, that means you're moral, or if you're irreligious, that means you're immoral. Rather, the point is, does your life and your behavior and your moral values naturally flow out of a consistent application of your worldview? That's what we would say to the no-duh approach. And what I'm going to suggest is that a consistent application of a skeptical, secular worldview does not provide much sense for a moral framework of life. And we'll see that in the next 2 points. So let's go to the empiricism approach. The problem with assuming that science can discern morality is that it is a fundamental misunderstanding of what morality is and what science is. Science is concerned with what is, while morality is concerned with what ought to be. And to go from is to ought requires much more than science. So for instance, let's just assume for a minute that all of our moral values do in fact emerge out of an evolutionary process. So the reason why we prize selflessness and honesty and courage is because these characteristics had survival value to our ancestors, while selfish, dishonest, and cowardly ancestors had low survival rates, weren't able to propagate their genes as much, and so now we naturally are repelled by that. Okay, let's just assume that that's an accurate description of where our moral impulses came from. This all, however, is simply just a description of what is. that does not actually provide a basis for an ought. Here's how you ought to be courageous. Maybe the skeptic will say, well, no, of course it gives me a basis for the ought. The ought is that instinct that we have. This, maybe you'll call it a herd instinct. It's an instinct that's given to us that we experience that informs our moral decisions that were forged in the millions of years of an evolutionary process. So if you feel strongly like cowardice is wrong, it's probably because cowardice doesn't lead to the human race flourishing, so you ought to follow that human intuition. Again, what that just described, if I were to ask you, what's the point of a soccer game? And you were to say, to score goals. But then if I were to ask you, but why are you scoring goals? You would say, to score goals. You haven't actually given me an explanation for why you score goals. If someone is saying that our moral basis simply comes from evolution providing for us these instincts, therefore you ought to follow those instincts, they've slipped something in. There is no ought. There is nothing that is now impinging upon you. Maybe your instincts tell you to be cowardly, maybe it tells you to be courageous, but what is that third thing telling you to choose one or the other? So C.S. Lewis gives you this scenario. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct, and the other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. So even if science could tell me what is moral or immoral, which I don't think it actually can, it has no basis for telling me what I must do. Maybe helping the old woman being mugged on the street comes from an ancestral evolutionary instinct that leads to my species flourishing. What if I don't want to help her? What if I don't want to risk my life? What if I don't want to inconvenience myself? Further, morality emerges, if morality emerges as an evolutionary process, then doesn't that mean that morality is inherently pliable, shiftable, moldable? Maybe our ancestors needed to be communal and altruistic and helpful, but what if being selfish and conniving is just simply the next rung on the evolutionary ladder? Charles Darwin himself, talking about how our environment actually shapes our moral framework, he says this: if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters. See, what someone is reaching for with the evolutionary explanation for morals is they want an objective standard that says it is wrong for you to murder, to take advantage of the innocent. It is wrong. But if it does come out of the flux of evolution, well, then it's moldable, it's malleable, and it's entirely determined by my context. So if you say that you find something morally reprehensible that I'm doing, well, maybe the environment that I grew up in, that I embodied, told me differently and has shaped my impulses and moral intuitions differently than yours. And again, because evolution is blind, it's not guided, you have no basis for actually telling me what I'm doing is wrong or that I ought to change. Science simply describes what is. It doesn't give oughts. Third, let's go to rationalism then. So what about the claim that some moral facts are just self-evident? Right? That this feels intuitively true to all of us. There are just some things that you just know that they're wrong, no matter what. You ought to be kind. You ought to tell the truth. You ought to not take advantage of the weak. And so this view says that if you just have the right cognitive framework, the right mindset to approach the world of self-evident truths, you can put together a moral system that works without relying on religious appeals at all. So Sam Harris, he's a neuroscientist and a philosopher. He's a popular advocate of this position today. And he blends this, a kind of utilitarianism, with this evolutionary model before. And here's what he says. Questions of right and wrong are really questions about the happiness and suffering of sentient creatures. If we are in a position to affect the happiness or suffering of others, we have ethical responsibilities towards them. So he's a moral realist. Sam Harris believes that there are hard moral facts, and you have obligations put upon you if it's within your power to increase someone's happiness or decrease their suffering. Does that make sense? Okay, the problem with this is that it's similar to the previous problem. There's an explanation for what is. He says, here's the definition of right and wrong, happiness or suffering in sentient creatures. But there is no basis for the ought at the end. He just simply makes it as an assertion. You have a responsibility. All right, and of course, you can just push that over in a second. Who says? According to who? What, you, Sam Harris? Further, there's no standard for happiness or suffering, nor any objective way to measure it. So let's do a thought experiment. There's always a shortage of human organs and people who are waiting for transplants in hospitals, right? Many people die every year as they wait for a transplant. Would it be wrong for hospitals to hire assassins to go out and kill citizens whose organs could then be used to save the lives of several people who will die unless they receive a transplant? So sure, the individual will die, yes. And that is a certain amount of suffering. But if we could quantify suffering and happiness, wouldn't that one person's death, which then would lead to multiple people's lives being saved, wouldn't the great aggregate of good be actually greater? The amount of happiness total, wouldn't that be increased through the small amount of suffering of exterminating one life? But of course, we all intuitively, we recoil at that idea. We think, no, you cannot kill. I mean, you can't, assassins cannot go out and kill. Okay, let's make it a little easier then. Okay, what if the person who was killed was an older person? What if they had actually signed up to become an organ donor when they died? What if the assassins made the execution painless and it happened in their sleep? They didn't know it was coming. And what if, let's even say this, what if the person who dies doesn't even have any relatives? There's no one there to mourn their death. It's a solitary individual. If they go missing, no one will know it happens. Is it now morally permissible for a hospital to hire an assassin to execute that person? Now, just take a moment to stop and reflect on what your moral judgments are doing right now. My guess is that inside of you, you just kind of bounced around, and part of you saw how, in a way, there's a logic to the execution of someone in that manner. And yet, there was something, as soon as you arrived at that conclusion, something inside of you recoiled at that. We naturally recoil. We say, okay, no matter what, it is always wrong to murder people. It is always wrong to do something where you're acting against the agency of another individual. But why? Why is that wrong? And the person who is relying on the self-evident truths would say, because human beings have rights. They have rights that are given to them, and it is wrong for you to violate their rights. Okay? Perhaps the most popular concept of human rights comes from the passing reference that we just mentioned previously before from the Declaration of Independence. So let's read the line from the Declaration of Independence and consider what someone who's looking for a foundation for human rights but is coming from a materialistic, a secular worldview, what do they find there? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what happens to that sentence if you evacuate a creator from it? Well, then human rights don't actually have a foundation to stand on at all. And that goes back to the quote that we said at the very beginning, what Michael Sandel said: human rights, freedom, justice are not empirically verifiable. We cannot prove that they exist because they must be given by a supernatural deity. And so that's why Yuval Harari, popular historian of the day, writes this: most legal systems in the world today are based on a belief in human rights. But what are human rights? Human rights, like God and heaven, are just a story that we've invented. They are not an objective reality. They are not a biological fact about Homo sapiens. And believe it or not, most of the values that we cherish in our Western culture today are not self-evidently true, nor are they practiced in many other cultures across time and space in the world today. So again, what I referenced earlier from that book, our assumption that compassion is good, that justice, we have a clear system in our mind of what justice means, of the value of standing up for the weak. I mean, I was walking down the street the other day and I saw someone who wore a shirt and it just said, "Be kind." And we see that all the time today, and it intuitively makes sense to us. Whereas many cultures around the world to this day, and certainly in the ancient world, would have been just totally baffled. Why would you be kind? I'm reading a book right now about a group of missionaries in Somalia. And it was during the 90s, and there was this horrible civil war in Somalia. And so it's just a war-torn nation, and it's just some of the most appalling tragedy and human evil that you could think of. And this missionary is there with a relief agency, and they're passing out food, and they're there with American soldiers have put boots on the ground to try to provide protection. And a child, a 12-year-old boy, with an AK-47 hidden inside of a coat, walks into the food line. And one of the guards notices that the boy has the gun. And the boy slips his hand in the coat and puts his finger on the trigger. Every American guard immediately locks their gun, brings their gun up, and yells at the boy to drop the gun. He doesn't drop it. They tell him, they warn him. The boy raises the rifle. Boom. The boy's shot in the chest. And he falls at the feet of one of the missionaries, 12-year-old boy. And the man just begins to weep. Weep at the sorrow of this nation, weep at the evil, weep at the death of this child. And all of the Somalians standing next to him rebuke him for crying. Why? This boy was obviously an idiot, they say. I'm not putting words in their mouth. This is what they say. The boy was an idiot. Why would he bring a gun here? Why would he try to do this? If he wanted to kill the Americans, he should have stood far off and shot from a distance. Stop crying. We need our food. Give us our food. If we assume that compassion and kindness, it's just something that's self-evidently true, it's just evidence that we haven't read widely enough, we haven't traveled enough. It's not. To make morally objective value judgments, this is right, that is wrong, what does that require? It requires a standard, right? If I know if there's a crooked line, if I know what a straight line is, I can say the line is crooked. But if there is no such thing as a straight line, then my very concept of that's crooked or that's straight shouldn't exist. If I lived inside of a dark room my entire life, I wouldn't be walking around saying, "Man, it's really dark in here." I wouldn't have the concept of darkness because I would have never experienced light. And yet we walk around this world just torn up inside. What's wrong? What's so broken here? That, I think, is evidence that there must be something beyond. There must be something that gives us a sense of there must be a right and there must be a wrong beyond this world. Therefore, I think that if we are to have objective moral values, objectively be able to say some things are right, some things are wrong, there must be a God. And so that's the first premise. Premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. The second premise is much easier to just respond to, and I'll do this just very quickly. The second premise is that objective moral values and duties do exist. So someone who takes seriously the weakness of the position that objective moral duties and values can exist without God, they may just say, well, okay, well, I guess objective morals don't exist then, right? That could be the simple response. And that was, especially in the second half of the 20th century, that was a really common perspective. Some of the people that I mentioned last time, French philosophers in particular, viewed that as just kind of the obvious conclusion. So Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, says, God does not exist, and all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. Everything is permissible if God does not exist. Now, Sartre was saying that positively. Everything is permissible. So you can sleep with who you want to sleep with. You can say what you want to say. You can believe whatever you want to believe, because there's no schoolmaster up in the clouds there to tell you that you're wrong. Right? So you go follow your own drum. But he was right here, he's referencing Dostoevsky in the book, The Brothers Karamazov. And in that book, Ivan Karamazov is the suave atheist who believes that God does not exist, therefore everything is permitted. But Dostoevsky in that novel is using that not positively but negatively. And the entire character of Ivan Karamazov is a warning. Here's the natural consequence. If you believe that everything is permitted, and of course at the end of the book, if you know the story, Ivan Karamazov goes insane. Because what does he experience? He experiences an enormous amount of guilt over what he has done wrong, yet he has imbibed a worldview that says there is no such thing as guilt. And he tries as hard as he can to just push that away, but the cognitive dissonance becomes to such a point that he just loses his mind. No one lives like a moral relativist. No one hears stories about children being shot in Somalia, of women being raped in Sudan. Nobody hears those things and says, not my problem. Or if you do, you're a cruel, cold monster. Or you're a stupid liar. And when that kind of evil comes to you personally, you do not shrug your shoulders with a French suave indifference. No one lives like this. And here's what I want to end with. Not only does no one live this way, but actually a view of moral relativism, a view that morality is subjective, maybe it's just a product of your culture, Well, it sounds like that would lead to this kind of like peaceful hippie utopia where we all get along and there's no problems at all. Actually, it becomes the fertile soil of the worst kind of exploitation and injustice. If there's no straight line, there is no transcendent standard that is over you and over me, and all of our moral preferences are simply opinions, then the only tool that I have to change your mind is force. I can't persuade you. I can't appeal to a higher standard. Maybe I can try to coerce you. I can try to bribe you. I can use peer pressure. I can use subtle tactics. But if at the end of the day you still don't agree with me, then the only thing I have left is power. And that's why in the 20th century, it was the overtly atheistic countries that executed the grossest and most vilest crimes against humanity. In the 20th century alone, 187 million people died from war or war-related atrocities. That is 10% of the population of the earth in 1913. That's more people who were killed in the 20th century and under that than the previous 19 centuries combined, including all of the wars of religion, all of the crusades, all of the inquisitions. If you're going to make an omelet, the old communist saying goes, you have to crack a few eggs. And if you want to establish utopia here on earth, and there's people in the way, You just got to mow them over. We need a transcendent standard that we can appeal to. Okay, so what does Christianity offer? 1 minute. Christianity offers a basis for human rights. Human rights is explicitly a Christian idea. It is an explicitly Christian idea that comes from the Christian doctrine of the image of God. All human beings are made in the image of God, therefore all human beings deserve protection, dignity, and rights afforded to them. And that is true whether you are someone who's on the inside or someone who's on the outside, whether you're strong, whether you're weak, whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, whether you're a part of my nation or you're not a part of my nation, whether you're on my side of the battle or you're on the other side of the battle. There are certain laws that govern all human interaction. It's predicated on the idea that every human being is made in the image of God. We have uncoerced conversion, salvation by faith alone. We don't force anyone to convert to Christianity by the tip of a sword, but rather they must be persuaded by truth in an open appeal to their reason. But most centrally, at the center of Christianity, we have a God of love and mercy who is the standard of our moral evaluations. Not only that, a God of love and mercy who is our source of forgiveness and grace. Because at the center of Christianity is a God who comes down and experiences injustice himself, who tastes what it's like to be under the boot of oppression, who knows what it's like to be slapped when you don't deserve to be slapped, to be accused when you don't deserve to be accused, and he knows what it's like. And so, but how does Jesus respond? He's at the cross being nailed to wood unjustly. And what is he doing? He's forgiving and blessing those who are killing him. That's the heartbeat of Christianity. So, what do we do about what Christians have done in the past? Right? Haven't Christians done really bad things in the past? Sure. But the issue is, does the acts of injustice that happened in the past, do those inherently flow out of what the Christian worldview teaches? Or is it another example of the clutch not actually being engaged? Was it happening where the reason why white slave owners living in antebellum South who were whipping children to death, was that because they were being too Christian? Or was it because they were not Christian enough? And so Frederick Douglass, the man that I opened with, is himself a Christian. And at the end of his story, he's very critical of the religion of the South. He explains that while he despised the slaveholding religion of the South, that was by no means the religion of Christianity. And so he says, I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of the land. You see, what Douglass did was he realized that the problem wasn't that people in the South were too into the Bible and too Christian. The problem was that they weren't enough. And so they just had a thin veneer of religiosity to cover over their ugly, ugly atrocities. So Christianity provides a worldview that I think, if you lean more into it, provides more resources for justice, for equality, for compassion, for kindness and forgiveness. Whereas I think a secular worldview, the more you lean into it, the more cognitive dissonance you actually find between what you intuitively know to be true, morally, and yet what your worldview leads you to cognitively. So that's a good reason to consider Christianity. Okay, go ahead and stop there and spend the rest of our time that we have with questions. So if you have a question, if you were someone who was skeptical of Christianity or you're curious about anything, what would you say in response to that?
The last point that you were making. Oh gosh. Okay, the last point you were making about Douglass, saying those evil slaveholders were not Christian enough. I think a lot of contemporary people today would say Christians aren't Christian enough. They hate homosexuals, or they hate the woman who has to get an abortion. So how would you address that?
Yeah. I would just say, because God is the one who sets the moral standards, that means that he's going to have moral evaluations that are going to be different than ours. And so I can't remember if I've used this illustration before already, but usually what I do in a situation like that is I ask the person, can you hypothetically agree to the idea that if there is a God, that God knows much more than you do? Almost everyone says yes to that. And I say, if you can concede that there is a God who knows more than you do, who has a perspective that you don't, is it not plausible that that God would likely have a different interpretation on certain moral issues than you do? And again, hypothetically, I think everyone says, well, yeah, I can agree with that. So the question that we have, and that's not enough, that just opens the door. Right? So then we say, okay, now, is it possible that God could have a different moral evaluation on homosexual acts, on the murder of a child, right? So on and so forth. And then I would just lean into that. And then I would probably also then just circle back around to the idea that God's moral standards offend every culture at some point. At some point. And ancient cultures would have been really, really scandalized by Christianity's teaching of love of neighbor, by Christianity's affirmation of the value of women. They would have found that really, really bizarre. And today we view those as like unqualified goods. I mean, if there's anything we like from Christianity, we like that it teaches that. And so it's just, we can intellectually agree with the idea that we may be wrong, God may know more than we do, but as we get into those particular kind of hot button issues, I usually try to just use that to open the door. What I've found, and I've mentioned this before, there are certain cultural issues today which are defeater beliefs for people, right? Because they don't represent defeater beliefs. So if I'm talking with a 20-year-old who's skeptical of Christianity, I'm already pretty certain what they think about gay marriage, about abortion, a whole host of things. And if I just open the gate with, God thinks homosexuality is a sin and abortion's wrong, at that moment they've shut their mind down to me because they've backfilled everything else I believe according to a certain internet trope that they have. And so what I want to do is I don't want to be deceptive. I don't want to make myself seem like I'm okay with that when I'm really not. But I just want to open doors just gently in those areas and then focus on other areas more prominently. Try to establish trust, make sure that they know who I am well, and then try to appeal to things that they find intuitively very attractive about Christianity. But then show that if you can, skeptical 20-year-old Julie, if you can find that Jesus' teaching on the care for the poor and the weak to be so attractive, and you see how much that your own worldview doesn't actually provide the resources for that. You think it does, but actually, let me show, poke, 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 it doesn't. Christianity does, though. And if you can see how it's right on that, couldn't you see how maybe you're wrong on these other issues? Jesus is someone that you're so attracted to, yet he is someone who seems to have no problem seeing that homosexuality is sinful, or that it's wrong to kill a child. So that's more of like a tactical kind of idea. But yeah, that's a great point. A great resource for this is a book by Greg Koukl called Tactics. It's just all about just stuff that I'm just talking about there, tactics. It's a book on evangelism, very helpful.
Having a moral standard is so important to God. Why did Jesus teach us through parables? Why didn't he just give us a rule book?
That's very good. Well, Jesus did give us a rule book. It's called the Ten Commandments. So Jesus, when Jesus came, Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, according to the Christian theology. And so his moral framework has been clearly established already in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so Jesus does teach explicit He expands upon the Old Testament, but he does also teach in parables in ways that are befuddling sometimes, absolutely. But I would just say, yes, there is very clear over Jesus' teaching that's objective.
If Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, if Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, and he has a moral understanding outside of our own, and he says homosexuality and abortion are wrong, but gives explicit instructions on how one should keep a slave, why is slavery wrong?
Oh, such a great question. And that's a question that, I mean, if you haven't been asked that question yet, it's just a matter of time before you will. So there's a number of really great resources that you can look to that will get into what slavery was like in the Bible. But let me just paint a couple of scenes. First, slavery in the Old Testament is significantly different than slavery in the New Testament. Slavery in the Old Testament is assumed to be taking place under the theocratic rule of Israel. And there are very certain stipulations and laws about what slavery looks like there. But so I want to break up. Imagine 3 blocks of slavery in your mind. There's Old Testament slavery, there's Greco-Roman slavery in the New Testament, and then there's antebellum Civil War slavery of America. All 3 of those look very different from each other. So for instance, Old Testament and Greco-Roman slavery were not race-based the way that American slavery was. No one was enslaved because of the color of their skin in those two. Those two. Thank you, George. Okay. He said a large number of slaves were from Ireland. Okay. Nevertheless, slavery wasn't predicated on the color of your skin in Old Testament or in the Greco-Roman world. The Greco-Roman world of slavery was brutal. You could kill your slave. You could beat your slave. Your slave was your sexual object. Your slave was just a receptacle for your passions. Kyle Harper, I think he teaches out of the University of Oklahoma. He's not a Christian, but he wrote a book on slavery in the ancient world called From Shame to Sin. And I mean, it was a brutal. So it wasn't. I think American slavery in the South was probably the grossest form of slavery that history has known. But Greco-Roman slavery wasn't far behind that. It was pretty bad. Slavery in the Old Testament is very different. Slaves have rights. If a slave was beaten by their master, they were immediately set free from slavery. You couldn't separate a slave from their spouse. Every 7 years, every slave was set free in the year of Jubilee. And the conception of slavery was just very different. When Abraham goes to pursue the kings of Sodom, he's trying to save his brother Lot, he arms like 300 of his slaves. So imagine a plantation owner handing out rifles to all of his slaves and saying, hey, come help me out, guys. And what would they do? They would shoot him right away, right? And so the institution of slavery in the Old Testament was just very, very different. What happened in the Greco-Roman world was not as bad as the New World. But your question, George, so I was just trying to lay out the delineation. If God set out these moral frameworks, why was he okay with slavery in the Old Testament? I would say that it was fundamentally different in the Old Testament. And then what we see in the New Testament, the teaching on slavery in the New Testament, this is a really complex issue, but Christians did not have any say in changes of institutions whatsoever in the New Testament. There was no democratic government that was taking place in Rome or in Greece. And almost all of the early Christians were themselves slaves. And that's a bit of an overstatement, but a large preponderance of the early church were slaves. So much so that Celsus, a critic in the 2nd century, tries to delegitimize Christianity as a movement because it's filled with so many slaves, women, and children. So obviously, it's an impotent feminine institution. And so manly Romans shouldn't believe in it. So here you have this nascent early church who has no political power, comprised mostly up of slaves, and they are controlled and governed by an ethic of nonviolence. Right? Christianity does not support violent revolutions. What is a slave to do? Right? There's no voting. They don't have any political power. What can they do? And so what we see in the New Testament is Paul exhorting and encouraging slaves to submit to their masters. They're to submit to their masters, but then every time that he tells a slave to submit to their masters, he then turns to any master and says, you must treat your slave like a brother. And at one point, Paul tells slave owners that they have a master themselves that they're going to have to answer to. In the book of Philemon, Paul is addressing a slave who's run away from his master. And Paul meets him, he's converted to Christ, and now out of his conversion, he believes that the right thing to do is for him to return back to his master. And so Paul writes a letter to Philemon to explain what Onesimus, the slave, should do and how he should be received. And Paul tells Philemon that he must receive him not as a slave, but as a brother. And so what Frederick Douglass wrote a brief little essay on the book of Galatians. Galatians 3:28 teaches that in the church there is neither slave nor free. And he said that was the little nuclear bomb that was eventually detonated to end the entire institution of Christianity, or the entire institution of slavery. And of course, it is Christians themselves who bring about the end of slavery, because they take time to take the ethic of the teaching of the New Testament to implement it into their life. But the reality is that Christians really drug their feet and took a long time to do it, which is lamentable. We would wish that it would be different. That's a long conversation to get into, but I would try to start there. I think the biggest things, if I were talking with someone who was a skeptic, I would emphasize, my guess, every time I've talked with someone who's skeptical, they assume that it's slavery in the South was the slavery of the Bible. And so the movies that they've seen, the TV shows they've seen, the books they've read, that's what they map in to the Old Testament and then to all of the teaching that God gives in the Torah on slaves and masters. They assume that's that.
So would you say that the Old Testament slavery was okay then?
That's hard to, the question was, would I say that Old Testament slavery was okay? When Jesus is asked about divorce, are you familiar with that? Jesus is asked by divorce. People say, if divorce isn't allowed, why did Moses give us a certificate of divorce? Why did he give us an exception for divorce? And Jesus' response is that God allowed divorce because of your hard hearts. But from the beginning, it was not so. That, I think, gives us an idea that some of the ethical teaching in the Old Testament is, while from God, is not ideal. In the sense, it's responding to humankind in its brokenness. And so we would say, while there are certain instances where divorce is regrettably allowed and permitted, that's not the Eden ideal. And I would say that slavery is exactly that way. I think that is something that is permitted. And in the ancient world, we just don't have time to get into this, but every civilization that has ever lived across the planet has practiced slavery. It is the most universal human institution. There is nothing more natural to human beings than using a club to, bludgeon someone else into submission to you and to make them do stuff that you don't want to do. Everyone has done that. And so that was how the world worked. And so I think God was responding to the world as it was due to the hardness of heart. But there's a reason why we see this progression into the New Testament that doesn't explicitly condemn slavery, but by no means provide support for it. Good question.
So you were talking about how, the empirical, rational, humanistic argument is that, it provides, they can say this is right or wrong, but it doesn't come up with the ought. Could somebody argue, though, that the creation, or that Christianity and religion were created to provide that ought, and then to provide recompense with eternal damnation if you don't act upon that ought?
Yeah. Just so if I understand what you're saying, do Christians just use the supernatural element as like a goad to
Yeah, could an atheist argue that religion was created in order to provide that ought? Like, this
Okay.
is what the species needs, but
Gotcha,
in
yeah.
order to convince people to do that.
So like an evolutionary explanation, religious, there's a Jonathan Haidt, as a psychologist, who says that there's a God-shaped hole in all of us, but I just think evolution put it there. And so he argues that religion serves a survival purpose in the sense that it makes moral sense of life. And so if a society ceases to practice religion, the society quickly begins to break down. And he's an atheist himself. And so he is an enthusiastic supporter of religion, all the while he thinks that none of it's true, it's just useful. So yeah, Jonathan Haidt, is that accurate? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah, you could say that, absolutely. The question is, I think the question would just be what worldview seems to make the most intuitive sense. We don't intuitively approach moral decisions from a raw, like a utilitarian perspective of, does this lead to my greatest good or not? When we make moral judgments, we intuitively believe that they really matter. And I'm saying something that's really true about the world. This really is evil. And if at the end of the day, I have in the back of my mind the knowledge that there is no such thing as evil or good, that this is just the byproduct of evolution creating these moral judgments inside of myself, then I think it actually then becomes counterproductive. I know that I can no longer actually say something is good or evil. Like, that's just an approximate judgment. Okay, we are over on our time. If you have more questions, I'd be happy to answer any of them, but we'll go ahead and end with a brief word of prayer. Father, we love you. We thank you for this day. We pray that you would be with us and help us as we take these truths and apply them in life. In Jesus' name, amen. And so.